changed its rhetoric to emphasize social inclusion and inclusive growth. And yet, its programs continue to face public and political resistance in some countries in the region. So since this is the 80th anniversary of the IMF, in this webinar, we want to assess the historical role of the IMF in the region. We also want to look at the present and examine current IMF programs in some MENA countries. And at the end of the webinar, we want to focus on the future and how the IMF can do better. So to address these different issues, we're very happy to have with us today Alia Moubayed and Nabil Abdo. Alia Moubayed is currently the emerging markets strategist at Jefferies International, and in the past she held research and policy responsibilities in the design and implementation of economic sector reforms in the MENA region. And Nabil Abdo is senior policy advisor on international financial institutions at Oxfam International. And I am Nur Arafeh. I'm a fellow at the Carnegie Middle East Center, where I'm co-leading the political economy program. So let's start with an assessment of the past. Alia, taking stock of the past 80 years, how would you assess the role played by the IMF and its impact in the MENA region?
First of all, thank you very much, Noor and the Carnegie Middle East, to really allowing us to focus on this important issue, because on a daily basis, what I realize is that there is more lack of knowledge about what the IMF is trying to do in the region and how what is the responsibility towards the economic performance of our countries. And it is extremely important to have these debates. I think when trying to look at the past, it is important to highlight at least two issues. First of all, as you mentioned, I think we cannot assess the IMF. And I think it's this is particularly true in our region because the negative connotation that we tend to hear from citizens in our region is rather on the negative side. Whereas, to be honest, when we look at the footprints of the IMF in the MENA region, compared, for example, to countries in Latin America or to Sub-Saharan Africa, the IMF has had very few programs or prolonged programs before the Arab Spring. It is only really after the Arab Spring period and the 2008 financial crisis and also the post-COVID era that the role of the IMF has grown in the region. Prior to that, we've only had one EFF in 1988 in Tunisia, in SBA in 1996 in Egypt, and in Iraq in small operation in 2007. So compared to what we see in other emerging markets, the role of the IMF in our region is limited, but its role is evolving within this global context that we'll talk about more. I think the second issue when we assess the IMF impact in the region is about our own local context. And what I mean by that is not only our economies, but also the fact that what's happening on the economic front, but also what is happening on the political and political economy front. I think first it's important to say that the MENA region is, as we know, is a very diverse region, and the IMF policies and impact should be viewed really on a case-by-case basis. So we have to color our assessment by the realities of each country's local context. The second is that in most countries that needed IMF intervention, there was a significant governance locally problem, like the case of Lebanon, and political economy challenges like in Egypt or in Tunisia. And third is that most of the region, if not all, unfortunately, still compared to other emerging markets, lacks the kind of voice and accountability where basically citizens have much more limited political space to influence and impact both the design of the policies, but also to review their impacts and help them evolve over time. So it is along these two lines that we really need to assess. And as you said, I think it's also important to remind everybody that the IMF is not only about programs. It has a regular surveillance that is done through the Article 4 report, so it can provide suggestions, and then it is up to the governments to follow or not. Only in the cases where there are programs, and currently we have mainly in Jordan, Egypt, Tunisia, some structural program with some structural reform elements, while we have rather more precautionary and policy support programs in the case of Morocco. So also what is nice is that the IMF has been having recently a significant change in the instrument depending on the degree of maturity in the policy and the situation of the program. But also the IMF has had an important impact in providing technical assistance program of all sorts. And I think we are one of the region that uses after Africa quite heavily. And I think the recent presence of opening up basically besides the METAC in Beirut and the Kuwait Center, the recent basically opening of the regional presence in Riyadh is really aimed at providing greater outreach, engagement, but also technical assistance to the region. But I think what is important on the policy, more front loading of fiscal consolidation and austerity to address issues of debt sustainability that we've seen in the earlier program in Egypt, Arab Spring, and the importance of having more supportive policies that support inclusive growth, job creation, private sector, and therefore a change in the quality of the fiscal adjustment, as opposed to focusing only on the amount of primary fiscal adjustment that is needed in the program. The second milestone, of course, was the pandemic, which only reconfirmed that our region lacks significantly in terms of social protection coverage, and at the end, such a huge shocks are likely to be significantly impacting the future path of public finances if not addressed immediately through basically realizing the fiscal space and redesigning, restructuring the expenditure composition to spend more on the health and social protection. And that we have seen clearly a move towards that in some of the latest program. And I think it's important that we're seeing also the IMF policy impacting the course of policies, even in oil exporting countries that don't necessarily need the IMF. And those we have seen it in particular in Oman, in KSA, through policy dialogue, in Oman and Saudi Arabia, really pushing the reform momentum on the fiscal frameworks, on the asset liability management, on greater fiscal transparency, and this has been positive. Having said that, obviously there are still a shortcoming, and as I mentioned, the fiscal consolidation focus of the IMF program remains the most controversial. But at the same time, I think it is important to look at what is happening in those particular countries. In Egypt, much of the need for fiscal consolidation comes from the unjustified expansion of public investment and building the growth model on a model of public investment driven growth that has rattled public finances and added to the external vulnerabilities of Egypt, leading to the crisis we saw in the 2019-2020 post-COVID. So the adjustment has to be done through domestic policies and the transformation of the growth model in many of these countries. And that is not only the responsibility of the IMF and its policies, but also it's about political choices in each society. And finally, I think the important point in our region that we don't see in other regions is that the IMF is not the main provider of external funding and liquidity. In our region, the IMF actually in many of the countries has been dwarfed by bilateral creditors, notably the Gulf countries, which have increasingly shaped both the commitment for structural reforms, but also the priorities of countries in terms of the sequencing of the reforms. We see that in Egypt. At some point, we saw it in Tunisia and and to a lesser extent in Jordan. But clearly, we cannot ascribed the fact that the IMF is the major player in terms of funding, as important as it is in terms of catalyzing private sector flows, because at the end of the day, the IMF presence has been essential for continuing private flows, whether portfolio flows or FDI flows into these economies, notably in the case of Egypt. So you could argue whether this was the IMF has had in its program some element of moral hazard, but I think what we saw in Egypt, and we'll have the opportunity to talk about that, is that if the commitment and the credibility of the program commitment is not there, even the presence of the IMF financing would not be enough to be catalytic for private external flows.
Thank you so much, Alia, for this brief but very exhaustive overview, specifically your perspective on the role of the IMF and the importance of actually looking. I think it's a very important point to look at the interplay between the local context and the role played by the IMF to understand each country on its own. Nabil, I would like to ask you a similar question. You've been working at Oxfam International for quite some time, focusing specifically on the role of the IMF in the MENA region. So I'd like to also get your perspective on how you think the role of the IMF and its approach have evolved over time. In the past few years, the IMF has been increasingly focusing on inclusive growth and social inclusion. How would you assess the progress made by the IMF in the region on these two issues and others?
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me and for this very timely discussion. I think it's a very complex issue in terms of how the IMF has evolved over the years, because it has gone a long way in terms of how it is viewed and how it's acting, and especially in the region. Indeed, the IMF is not the same institution that we know, the same institution that has implemented the notorious structural adjustment programs in the 80s and beginning of the 90s, but there has been some evolution. The question is how much it evolved, and in reality, how the evolution has translated on the ground. And I think, Alia touched on a really important issue regarding the perception of the IMF in the region, and in many other parts of the world where people really don't like the IMF to be present in their countries, especially in terms of implementing loan programs, especially the general population, because of the reputation that the IMF had in those periods of the structural adjustment programs in the 80s. So it happened in terms of the impact it had on on poverty, on inequality, especially in the African continent and Latin America, as Alia mentioned, and in the region, in the countries that underwent these programs. What you have seen back then was basically, I mean, the neoliberal orthodoxy that was implemented, and the IMF has been or was the spearheading, if you want, the implementation of this neoliberal orthodoxy that relied on privatization, deregulation, liberalization of the economy, etc. And it had those, straitjacket programs during the structural adjustment period, where it imposed on all countries and also on some countries in the region a wholesale, if you want, deregulation and privatization and dismantling of the welfare system that was really present in the region. And I think it's really important when we talk about the region is to also look at it from a political economy perspective, especially in the countries that have had a history with the IMF or that are currently implementing IMF programs, especially when we talk about countries like Tunisia and Egypt, to a certain extent Jordan. There was this kind of implicit social contract, some call it coercive social contract, that was implemented in the countries in the region, where there was this kind of tacit agreement or coercive agreement where governments or states would provide their citizens with education, with work, with health coverage, etc., while they would concede or are made to concede to relinquish political freedom and freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, etc. So there was this kind of social contract that was broken in this period, in the 90s, in the 80s, especially. I mean, the structural adjustment programs have accelerated this kind of break, where we have seen one party of this contract relinquish what it had promised, mainly, the state not providing this kind of welfare, of robust welfare system, while citizens continue to be under, repression and all of this. So and when we talk about the IMF footprint in the region, like you mentioned, especially, the Arab Spring was one of the major milestones in the region, and I believe that one of the main instigators of the Arab Spring, or the motivation for people to take the streets, was this kind of relinquishing of this, what I said, like the disappearance of this welfare state, or the extreme weakening of the welfare state, where people demanded, social justice, bread, work, all of it. Their main demands were around, socioeconomic rights as well as political rights, but the socioeconomic rights were the forefront. And we have seen that unions, especially in Tunisia and Egypt, they were at the forefront of this kind of protest. Even in Jordan, when we have seen mobilizations, we have seen independent units, etc. So you have this kind of centrality of economic and social rights. And I want to pause here because, also this coincided with the shift with the IMF, because the IMF is mostly known with its aggressive austerity policy that it has pushed on countries for decades. And then with the 2008 global financial crisis and the disaster we've seen in terms of, especially in the Eurozone, and the record of the IMF in Greece, etc. So it coincided with this kind of, if global reflection with the 2008 crisis about, is neoliberalism the way to go? Where did we go wrong, etc. And at the same period, the IMF published a very known, famous paper, a research paper by the staff called "Neoliberalism Oversold," and this paper was very had a great impact on everyone, saying, "Oh, wait, the IMF is really rethinking its approach, rethinking its economic orthodoxy, and now it's the dawn of a new world." So we saw a discursive shift in the IMF discourse, where they were starting to say, "Oh, wait, inequality does actually matter. Inequality can hurt growth. Inequality can be bad for economies, etc., etc. So we need to pay more attention to the social aspects of our intervention, to the social aspects of our our programs, of the policies we prescribe to countries. So the discursive shift, we've seen it evolve gradually, and now with the COVID pandemic, it took also another acceleration, where we see the IMF talk about the need to tax, to progressive taxation, etc. And this was a bit absent historically in the IMF discourse. But if you want, the permanent problem that we have with the IMF, especially as a civil society organization, is that they became very adept in adopting civil society discourse, while in reality doing the opposite. So in a sense, we see the managing director talk a lot about these issues, the dangers of inequality, talk about progressive taxation, etc. It became at the forefront. But when we see the policies on the ground, it's a bit different. So in terms also of policies, we've seen the IMF adopt gender mainstreaming policy, adopt the social spending policy, etc., to integrate in its programs, and this is definitely positive. But if we zoom into the MENA region, especially the economic, especially the uprisings, as Alia mentioned, the uprisings were, if you want, the moment where the IMF had a grand return to the region as this institution that is poised to support countries and people in their transition from the pre-uprising period to the post-uprising period, and this period deemed as a democratic transition and economic transition and all of this. So we had this Deauville partnership, the Deauville partnership that came along, where the IMF, along with the G7 and GCC countries, the Gulf cooperation countries, said, okay, now we have to have this kind of financial package to help these countries in order to transition to a new reality. And what effectively this, how it played, is that I mean, in my opinion, this marked, if you want, a period of a counter-revolutionary push in terms of the aspirations of the people in the region, where essentially the message was from the IMF, from these economic partners of those countries in the region, that you can have your democratic transition, you can elect leaders democratically, whatever, especially when you talk about Tunisia and Egypt, and to a certain extent, Tunisia and Egypt specifically. However, economic policies will remain the same. And then those economic policies are policies, marked by austerity, by if you want, the market orthodoxy, and the demands for social justice, for jobs, for the public or the state to play a bigger role in providing public service, free, quality public services, in providing decent jobs, etc., would be relegated to more the private actors, and it means that economic decision making was rendered, excluded from the domain of the public and from the people. So the people were about to vote, etc., on political participation, on the constitution, etc., but they had no say in the economic programs that were implemented after the revolutions. And we have seen this in Tunisia, we have seen this in Egypt, and in Jordan as well. So this is, I think this is how we can view the role of them. Of course, it has evolved. It has evolved after that, but essentially, the policies that are implemented through the IMF programs are very unpopular. Not because people don't understand what these policies are, because I think the people understand very well what these policies are, and we've seen this happening. In Tunisia, we had, the post-uprising period was a period of market social unrest. The unions, the UGTT, was a fierce opposer to the IMF programs, because there was no genuine social dialogue. There was no genuinely homegrown reform program that the IMF can support. In Jordan, we've seen the same with the protests in 2018. In Egypt, there is in Egypt, for example, before the COVID pandemic, Egypt was the poster child of the IMF. The IMF, in every review, they would praise the Egyptian leadership on its firm hand in terms of implementing the program despite the vested interest against it, etc. And this is not only about the region. I mean, we've seen now what in the last few weeks what happened in Kenya, where dozens of protesters were killed, who were protesting against the budget that was supported by the IMF, and the IMF were pressuring. I mean, it was part of the conditionalities in the program to implement. So I think we should not see the region as an exception in terms of how the IMF operates and why. And I think we can talk more in details why these kind of social unrest are often associated with the IMF programs. And I wanted to mention one last thing, and I'm not saying here that
quickly, Nabil, yeah,
that the IMF is responsible for all this. What I'm saying is that those programs are always agreed with the governments. Governments can negotiate those programs. They can push back. They can provide alternatives. The IMF also is in negotiation. So I think there is a shared responsibility. However, the opaqueness of how the IMF operates, of these policies, of decision making that comes about when a program is decided and the conditionalities are put, and the lack of civil society participation, and we can talk more about that. Really, that emphasizes more, and that makes people more wary of the IMF in their countries. And I think the IMF needs to do more in order to ensure this kind of participation. And I'll stop here. Sorry for taking over.
Thank you so much, Nabil. You raised so many questions. I would like us to talk at the end of towards maybe the end of the webinar about actually civil society engagement, because this is also another area that the IMF has been focusing on. But if I may sum up what you just like your perspective. Basically, for the past a couple of decades, we saw a shift in the IMF's rhetoric, but this shift was not, or this rhetorical shift is not reflected in reality or on the ground when it comes to the different programs and what they are calling for. So it's very interesting. We have these two different and complementary perspectives of the IMF and its role. I'd like us now to move to focus on the present, because as I mentioned in my introduction, the IMF still has some programs in the MENA region, and I'd like us to start with a specific focus on Lebanon, actually, because since 2019, Lebanon has been experiencing a deep economic and financial crisis, and in April 2022, after nearly 2 years of talks, the IMF and Lebanon signed a preliminary staff-level agreement, which entailed restructuring of the public debt, reforming the banking system, and improving governance. Alia, how would you assess the IMF's strategy for Lebanon in the present, and what are really the key elements to get Lebanon out of its crisis? I know this is a very complicated question, will not have all the time to discuss it, given the very complex situation. But in if you can just in 10 minutes, less than 10 minutes, give us your views on that.
Sure, and maybe a segue to Lebanon. I would like just to highlight that actually this is a situation where actually it shows the role of the IMF completely different in its approach, in my view, to what we see in other countries where the IMF was approaching a potential program, and that speaks a lot to the local context in which I said. I mean, understanding the political economy context in which the IMF operates has been, and designing the program in a way that maximizes the chances of meeting the objective of a program, whether it is helping bring debt to sustainable level, or supporting growth, or adjusting the fiscal, improving fiscal policy in terms of fairness, and all that depends on basically a good reading of who is able to have levers who has leverage on policies. And I think the case of Lebanon shows, in my view, that the IMF, at least in the beginning of the crisis, has the right strategy, in the sense that it knew it was coming to work in an environment that is extremely characterized by extreme state capture, where a combination of long-standing political actors have a very strong and intertwined interest with the business elites of the countries, and have basically tried for a long time to mischaracterize the gravity, and maybe this is where, prior to the crisis, the IMF is perceived in Lebanon to have cozied up with what we call al-manzoumi in Lebanon, basically this combination of political and business interest, to have hidden and provided a wrong sense of false, basically, stability prior to 2018, 2019. So there is a blame that citizens have on the IMF. But the strategy post-crisis, of course, in my view, was the right one, in terms that the IMF knew how difficult the territory is, how the level of state capture, weak governance. And I think probably Lebanon is the only country where the IMF faced a division within the government team, in the government wanting to do a restructuring of the debt of the banking system and of the public sector, whereas the central bank, as the key institution in the country, with the governor at that time, very solidly, basically joining forces with the Association of Banks, prevented a progress in the policy dialogue in the IMF. And I think the fact that at that moment in 2020 until 2022, that the IMF stood firmly on its position, which was a principled position in terms of when you have a country where the governance is the problem, you have to start there, but by improving its governance. And this is why the IMF has insisting on important elements of lifting banking secrecy, cleaning up the banking system, to create much more transparency in order to understand the size and of the problem. And I think the non-cooperative attitude of the authorities was a problem, despite the fact that there was a lot
Alia, your voice is cutting off.
Of transparency, because in Lebanon, everything
Alia,
so the right position at the beginning of the crisis in Lebanon.
Alia, apologies for
now, 5 years after, obviously, it was very clear that that was the right choice of the fund, to insist on MEATI government did not deliver on any of the reforms that were just citizens, but rather more with the ruling elite.
Alia, apologies for interrupting you, but your voice is cutting off. Can you please turn off your camera, because we haven't been, your voice is not clear. So if you can turn off your camera, I know you have some internet connection issues. If you can turn off your camera, because like you're making a very important point. So we want to make sure that we hear the argument correctly. Alia, we can't hear you now. You're on mute. Yes. So now, if you just put yourself, if you can unmute yourself, and hopefully we'll be able to hear you.
Yeah, so just to say that I think the strategy of the fund was the right thing in front of, given the political economy context. I think now, 5 years after, the question is, what can be done when basically the same ruling elites are insisting on making any future IMF program that is inevitably necessary for Lebanon, even now more after the ongoing war in the south. You need external funding, and that can only come through the IMF. But the fact that the Lebanese are not only facing the very harsh realities of a geopolitical context and war in the south, but also this insistence on on delaying further the reforms, on insisting on adding the losses of the financial sector to the sovereign, making debt sustainability thus impossible to achieve over the long term, is putting the whole viability of the Lebanon's economic model at risk, in my view. And I do think that without significant political change inside Lebanon, it would be extremely hard to see an engagement not only with the IMF but with the rest of the international community. So I think this time around the IMF had the right diagnostics in terms of political economy context, and took the right position in terms of insisting on governance. The balance of power is unfortunately not tilting towards the reformers yet. And the current outlook on growth, given the high level of political risk, makes any engagement down the line with the IMF even more difficult, and will require significantly more difficult policy prescriptions to get out of the crisis.
Thank you so much, Alia. I'd like us to move to two other countries that are currently having programs with the IMF. So basically, since the Arab uprisings, Tunisia has participated in two IMF programs, while discussions over the third one were suspended by President Qais Said last year. As for Jordan, the government signed a staff-level agreement in May, which would actually be their third program since the one established in 2012. So, Nabil, can you tell us more about how these IMF programs in Tunisia and in Jordan have so far affected their respective economies following the Arab uprisings?
Yeah, thanks. So I think those two countries are really interesting to contrast. I mean, because of their different political systems and economies as well. But I mean, for me, the point of analysis of any IMF program is who bears the brunt of reforms. I mean, we can discuss, economic data like how much GDP has changed or improved, etc., or deficit has improved or not. But for me and for us as Oxfam, the crux of the issue is the people and inequality and who bears the brunt. And when we talk about austerity-focused programs that have been undergone in Tunisia and also now in Jordan, it is clear. I mean, austerity is about discipline. It is about disciplining the economy, but also disciplining consumers and the people, and giving this kind of illusion that everyone should suffer or should make a sacrifice from the reforms, whereas in reality, those who are sacrificing are the most vulnerable people. So if we look at for example in Tunisia, I mean, I can't delve too much into it because we don't have enough time. But so during the period of the IMF-backed reforms, what you have seen is, for example, when you talk about tax, because the IMF they usually also have a lot of tax recommendations and a lot of tax policies that are recommended by the IMF are regressive. And so, for example, what you have seen that between 2010 and 2018, the contributions of corporations to total tax revenues fell by 37%, while that of household increased by 10% over the same period. This tells us where the burden of the reform lies and where the burden of the revenue-raising measures and austerity lies in Tunisia. And another also, I think, another very telling indicator is, for example, that during the same period, the share of funding for education in the public budget in Tunisia decreased from 26.6% to 17.7%. And also the share of health expenditures also decreased from 6.6% to 5% as well. So here we see like the social sectors that touch on on most people have decreased, and that is translated into people being worse off. And this also translates into, you know, like for example, what we can call a disguised privatization. Like Tunisia is not did not privatize education, did not sell off its education institutes. But if we see the evolution of private versus public schools, we see, for example, that private schools have increased by more than 900%, while public schools have only increased by 2% in terms of numbers during those periods as well. So here we can see like there is these kind of reforms really favor, you know, the richest in society and the most on the account of the most vulnerable. And in Tunisia and in Jordan, we have seen similar features in terms of the programs, which are reduction of public employment, because it is said that public employment is bloated. We can also debate on that, but also that is the move toward regressive taxation, the lifting of subsidies, etc. But the difference is between Tunisia and Jordan is that Tunisia had a very strong labor union, as I mentioned earlier, and because of the aggressive austerity that has been pursued in Tunisia over two successive IMF programs, the second program before COVID was temporarily suspended, and because of the government could not implement conditionalities, especially those related to public sector and to subsidies, because of the resistance of the unions, and this has translated into the program being going off track. So, for example, one positive thing that we can say about the IMF is that they learned from the lesson of Tunisia, is that in the negotiations for the third program that were suspended, the IMF insisted on the government to have a social dialogue with the unions, that the unions are on board with the program, that the unions are okay with the reforms, etc., so the program can go on. The program the negotiations were suspended, but that's a different issue. That's where they learned I think a valuable lesson that should be implemented everywhere. In Jordan, I think the fact that Jordan has had programs since 2012, successive program without a break till now, and like they just signed recently a new program, is an indictment of the IMF, because the IMF is not supposed to be intervening in countries for a short term, certainly not for around 15 years in a row. So the question begs, who is designing public policies or financial fiscal policies in Jordan, where we have like 4 or 5 IMF programs in succession that also has not yielded. So when we need the IMF for 15 years in a row, it means the program is clearly failing. Otherwise, there is a different question that needs to be asked: is why Jordan keep getting this kind of support with the IMF after all this period without getting the economy on a sustainable path? And the austerity in Jordan has been also exemplified also by the containment of public sector employment. Although, for example, the IMF is always saying that labor force participation for women is low in Jordan. That's why we need to support women in employment, while women are overly represented in public sector. So reduction in public sector employment is also negatively affecting women. And on the other hand, they have removed drastically reduced subsidies in Jordan, electricity subsidies, etc., under the pretext that the savings we get from subsidies, because subsidies are supposedly regressive, the savings from subsidies would go to supporting social programs and to alleviating poverty, etc. However, the numbers don't show that. For example, that between 2012 and 2017, the budget allocated to social assistance decreased by 9%. That's the same period where subsidies were reduced. the cost of subsidies in the same period was reduced by 88%. So we see those kind of savings do not actually go to supporting social programs, and also pushing for targeted social programs that, like for example, the National Assistance Fund in Jordan that targets the poorest in society, or the poor, those who are under the poverty line. Like the latest numbers is that it covered 220,000 poor households, while we have over 600,000 households in poverty in Jordan. So we see these kind of reforms that do not really, have this impact on people. They might generate, good GDP numbers or growth, but when this kind of reforms, when the economy is not put on a sustainable path in Jordan, and I repeat, the most drastic indicator of this is that Jordan has been needing the IMF for 15 years. There are I think huge questions to be asked around this. And I want to conclude with one thing. For example, also if you focus on Jordan, for all this period, the IMF never once did a distributional impact assessment of its policies in Jordan, or the policies it's back in Jordan. And distributional impact assessment are assessments that are made of the proposed conditionalities, even the ones that have been implemented, saying how these policies have impacted income distribution, have impacted inequality, poverty, gender inequality, etc. For those period of 13, now 15 years, no such assessment has been done, is also something very serious and very concerning, because when the IMF becomes the principal economic policy makers in a country, I think also there is accountability towards the people. And we've seen what happened in 2018 with the protests around the tax reform, etc. That really people are affected a lot, and especially now with the cost of living crisis, etc. People have barely to meet their daily needs. So maybe I'll stop here. I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, no, you did. Thank you so much, Nabil. I'm aware of the time. We only have 14 minutes left. So I would like to remind the audience, if you have any questions for Nabil or Alia, to ask them on the private, not on the chat on YouTube and live stream. So I'd like us to we focused on the past, providing, and you both provided us with an assessment of how you view the role of the IMF in the region and how it has evolved. And we focused on the present, Lebanon, Tunisia, and Jordan. I'd like us to, because we're moving towards the end of the webinar, to focus on the future, Alia and Nabil. And Alia, I'll start with you. How do you think could the IMF and other international financial institutions do better in the future? What are some areas that IFIs can improve on, based on your large experience working with them on economic sector reforms in the region? You're on mute, Alia. Alia? I think Alia is frozen. Again, some internet connection issues. So maybe I'll jump to you, Nabil. If you can just give us your perspective on how the IMF can do better in the future.
Yeah, thanks. So I think there are a lot of issues that the IMF can improve. I mean, first, like I said, systematically conducting this kind of distribution impact assessment of proposed reforms in all.
Sure, Nur, and I'm sorry for the connection. And
sorry, Alia, we're with Nabil. We started with Nabil, so I'll get back to you when Nabil is done. Yeah, please go ahead, Nabil.
Okay, so the first thing is those kind of distribution impact assessments are really necessary, so people can know what they would expect from the impact of those reforms on their daily lives and on their well-being, and for governments to be able to propose or to figure out alternatives that would be less harmful on people than austerity and this fiscal consolidation drive of the IMF. So I think this is really important. Second, the IMF need to pay attention to inequality, not only discursively, but in terms of its policies. So, for example, our data and our research has shown that For example, the richest people in Egypt saw their wealth increase by more than 50%, from 99 billion to 150 billion in 2 years, from 2020 to 2022. In Jordan, also the richest grew their wealth. Also, they almost doubled it in the same period. While in the same time, we don't see the IMF and the government in their loan programs recommending more progressive tax policies, and particularly taxing wealth, taxing net wealth, etc., and all those kind of policy that would amass a huge amount of revenues from the richest, instead of squeezing the most vulnerable dry through austerity measures. And we saw that the wealth tax in Egypt, for example, could double health funding. This is not something insignificant. A third thing that the IMF can do is integrating its social or social analysis and social policies, like for example the social spending floors that they are implementing in all countries, which are positive developments by the IMF, which is a minimum floor on spending on social sectors. They should integrate it in the program in general, and not put it as an add-on, as something nice to have as a checkbox. While you have, a massive program built on austerity, it means built on cuts from public spending, while at the same time you expect countries to increase spending on health and education. Countries, they need to prioritize, and they prioritize austerity because if they don't do the austerity measures that the IMF tells them, the program will be suspended. However, if they don't increase spending on health and education, the program will go on as nothing has happened. So the IMF need to integrate in genuine matter those issues of inequality and social spending and health and education in its programs. And I think, and fourth, I think the IMF needs to have a genuine consultation, genuine discussions with civil society organizations, with movements, with unions, and all of that, and not the cosmetic consultation they do, which are more information sharing. Because you can't have a homegrown program and say, oh, the Egypt program or the Jordan program is a homegrown program, while the people are excluded from saying their opinion on it, from participating in this kind of policy making and saying what their priorities is. Because what you end up with is either social tensions and protests like we saw in Tunisia, we saw in Kenya now, or you end up with massive repression. And when there's repression, there's no contestation, and then the IMF can pretend that everything is going well. So we need to have this.
So the problem is not the IMF. The problem is the repression and the authorities, Nabil. I mean,
Yeah,
sorry
exactly,
to intervene, but
no,
I think again, it is very easy to blame the IMF, while the problem is one of local governance. In Tunisia, the former prime minister has put a program that was the first one that was done based on consultation, and it presented it. But the problem was an internal power struggle in the country. So it's very easy to say that it's the IMF that has imposed. Actually, the IMF, both in Egypt and in Tunisia, have done a self-evaluation of the program. At least the program, the self-evaluation of Egypt is even publicly disclosed, and there are lessons learned that in successive programs from successes and failures in each part. But I'm not saying that there is nothing to blame on the IMF, but I think it is extremely important to say, particularly when we compare the MENA region versus other emerging markets, is that the problem of weak governance, lack of basically participation of citizens in decision making, the weakening of institution, the capture of institution, like it is also the case in Lebanon in parliament today, has been a major problem for the implementation of reforms, and not the IMF.
But can I clarify?
Quickly, yes.
Yeah. I didn't say the IMF is responsible for repression. I mean, they don't have a police to repress people. What I'm saying is the IMF turns a blind eye to those issues. That's what I'm saying. There is a problem of weak governance. There is a problem of corruption. There is a problem of lack of participation, etc. All of that. But the IMF is not. So the IMF is responsible also in terms of figuring out or thinking about how not to, at the least, enable this kind of repression. So, for example, I
Absolutely, and
can
I
give you an
think that's what
example.
we need to do in the future,
Yeah,
working with the IMF.
yeah, exactly. So, for
So
example, when you praise Egypt in 2019, if I remember correctly, when you praise Egypt for the firm implementation of the program, implementing the program in a firm hand, I can get you the quote. In an Egypt context, when you say firm hand in terms of implementing policies, it's not something you can say casually, considering considering the context in Egypt. In Tunisia, they suspended the program because the unions weren't conceding to the cuts and to the cuts of public sector. But
no,
at the
that's
end,
not why the reason of
but at
suspension
the
of the
end,
IMF in Tunisia. But I think we really need to focus on the future, and I think
no, I'm focusing.
there are realities in those international institutions, and there are balance of power, and unfortunately, no one is saying that the IMF is not subject to political consideration. And this is why sometimes, of course, the board at the IMF votes to continue to support a program, even when the course of policy may not be the best one that will save. But then there is an opportunity cost of not having a program, and then when faced with external shocks that threaten basically a complete basically balance of payment crisis, etc., that the risk is that you could end up with a much bigger problem because of currency devaluation, hyperinflation, etc., similar to what we saw in the case of Lebanon. So the balance is certainly not there, and the ideal is to have strong ownership of the program, and that the programs be done in a participatory manner, and that I definitely agree with you. The last thing I want to say on what on the future is that the future, unfortunately, in the region is not necessarily a bright one, be it because of the conflict and ongoing and the risks that is be accompanying it, the post-conflict realities that require the huge financing, or the fact that many of the countries since the beginning of the Arab Spring are actually saddled with more debt and external vulnerabilities, which leaves extremely limited room for maneuver, both for the policymakers as well as for the IMF continued support. So what we need to do is to ensure that that the IMF's role, I think that the IMF role in the next phase will have to be bigger in the region, but it will have be bigger and more and better
Alia, you're cutting off.
to basically deal with those very difficult trade-offs that the countries face. That are in distress stage, like Tunisia, and those that didn't have the global rates easing and able to rely increasingly more on markets, but they will still unfortunately need the
we lost Alia, but Nabil, Alia was basically implicitly answering a question we had from the audience regarding how the current wars in the Middle East and the risk of having a wider regional conflict, how this might affect international assistance programs. If you can respond to that in less than a minute, please, because we were running out of time.
Well, I mean, that's a difficult question to answer. And how would this war look like if it happens? Hopefully, it won't happen. But we have seen, I mean, in terms of internationally, aid has been dwindling. support for countries, especially for public goods and for climate, for things that are good for people like education, health, etc., are receding in favor of more support for armies, for security, for border control, etc. So we're already seeing this kind of trend, and I think this is really worrying. And this highlights that rich countries need to step up and need to be able to support developing countries, and not through security measures, and not for developing countries to play the role of border control for their borders, but to have like genuine assistance based on policy reforms, on genuine support for people. And a war would certainly exacerbate this kind of trend and this kind of security trend, which is really worrying.
Thank you so much, Nabil. Unfortunately, we ran out of time, so we won't have the opportunity to respond to two other questions in the chat bar. But thank you so much again, Nabil and Alia, for your brilliant insights based on a big experience you have either working with or assessing the work of the IMF in the region. I hope this was it was a very engaging discussion. And I hope this was also a rewarding, insightful one for the audience. We tried to discuss in 1 hour, critically assess the role of the IMF in the past, how it has evolved, how its current programs are shaping some countries in the MENA like Lebanon, Jordan, and Tunisia, and how the IMF can do better in the future and integrate its different the change in its discourse more seriously into its programs. So thank you so much again, Nabil and Alia, for joining us. Thank you for our audience, and I will see you hopefully in September in another policy webinar. We're taking a break in August. Thank you so much, and have a good day or evening, depending on your time zone.
Thank you, Nur. Thank you, Alia.